Hi, I'm Ross Tucker here in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a sports scientist and I am presenting to you today a video on what happens to physiology, fitness and performance when we stop training or significantly cut back on our training. And the reason this is relevant and being done today is because most of the world is now in a phase of lockdown as a result of Corona and COVID-19. We've been forced to stay indoors, gyms are closed, and therefore our access to normal training routines has been massively disrupted, if not taken away completely. And so this is a video in which I want to try and describe to you a little bit about what happens and how you can reduce the effects. It's actually part two. Part one was a talk that I gave on exercise and immune function, and you can find that on all the channels. So have a look at that for a bit of context and introduction. But as I said in that one, this was a talk that I initially gave to a group of personal trainers at Virgin Active here in South Africa, who I do a little bit of work for, upskilling and educating those trainers. And so when I refer to clients in this talk, that's the reason. They were the initial target market. But I hope that everyone finds some value in this as we explore exactly what's happening with detraining and how you can mitigate. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can walk through this PowerPoint slide together. As mentioned, this was done for Virgin Active South Africa, and it had three parts: exercise and the immune system, which I've done. It's in the past, find that elsewhere. This one is all about the physiology of detraining, and I guess most importantly, some mitigation strategies, what you can do to prevent that. So lockdown has, as I mentioned, significantly reduced what we can and can't do. In some countries, we're not even allowed to go out and exercise. South Africa is one such example. And so we're having to get creative in our own gardens or homes around what we can do to keep our fitness and not lose all the gains that we've worked to earn in the past few months or years. And the principles upon which this detraining concept rests are reversibility, which is use it or lose it, and adaptation. When we apply a stress to the body, we adapt to that stress, and that's basically what fitness and performance are, is the positive adaptations to stresses. Now, I think to begin with, it's worth mentioning that there's a spectrum of options available to you during these lockdowns. At the one extreme, you could actually just laugh exercise off and say, you know what, I'm going to use this lockdown time to deal with all the other things going on in my life. And that's a holistic viewpoint. Well, I guess it excludes exercise from the holistic viewpoint, but it's holistic in other domains. And it might actually be that that's a sensible thing to do. For instance, you might now find yourself 24 hours a day at home with your kids. You're trying to juggle family responsibilities with work. And it might actually be that exercise is just one thing too many to take on. If that's the case, then accept that exercise is not a priority right now and that you are actually going to put it on the back burner. I'm not suggesting you'll be lying in the bath sipping wine during this time, but it might just be that not exercising is the best thing. That's your call. At the other extreme is something I wouldn't advise, but a number of people have done, and that's to try and keep their routines as similar as possible. As in, lockdown be damned, I'm going to keep going. And so this, for instance, was a picture that was posted of a man who ran a marathon, an ultra marathon in his house. He did 6,500 laps of a 7-meter circuit in his living room, covered 50 Ks. There have been cases, I'm sure you've seen, a French man ran a marathon on his balcony, up and down 7 meters at a time. Here in South Africa, where we are nuts about endurance running, someone did a comrades marathon, which is 90 kilometers around his house in the garden. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. I think that for various reasons covered in part one, now is probably not the time for you to be working on such extreme endurance feats. And so instead, I think there's a balance needs to be found between these two extremes, where you can exercise from home in a targeted way that ultimately will benefit you in the long term. So that's what this talk is about. Now, conceptually, to understand what happens when we detrain, it pays to understand what happens when we train. And the idea for this, the conceptual example comes from Trent Stellingwerff, who's a very accomplished exercise physiologist in Canada who gave a similar talk, and he showed this graph. And what you're looking at here is adaptation on the y-axis over the days in which a person is exposed to heat and they acclimate to that heat. And so you'll see, for instance, that plasma volume shown in blue goes up. Heart rate drops because our cardiovascular system becomes adapted and we're better able to handle the hot conditions. Core temperature at the same intensity is lower because we become better at thermoregulation. And the consequence of all this, shown here in olive green, is that our exercise capacity improves. When we now think of detraining, what you have to do is read this same graph not from left to right, but from right to left. And so I'll do that for you. I'll just flip it right around. That's what detraining looks like. So where before everything was happening to cause adaptation, we are now losing adaptation, like plasma volume comes down, heart rates go back up, exercise capacity drops, and eventually gets back to almost a baseline. And so when we consider detraining, all the changes we saw that enabled adaptation now run in reverse or backwards, in rewind. And that's not unique to cardiovascular function. So this is a summary that comes from a review article by Inigo Mujica back in 2000, it remains true today, in which he describes a number of cardiovascular changes with detraining. See, for instance, VO2 max drops, blood volume, as I showed you here, drops, heart rates, submax and max go up, endurance performance drops or decreases. This is what happens to the metabolic system. So for instance, a number of enzymes and proteins that are responsible for how we metabolize or use glucose and fats, fatty acids, are reduced in activity. And then we see the same thing for the neuromuscular system, where we have decreased capillaries, increased oxidative enzymes, decreased mitochondrial ATP production, and ultimately a loss of strength and power. So the key points here are that all the systems that improve with training will now reverse when the stimulus is withdrawn or removed or reduced. Basically, we're saying that what goes up must come down, and what goes down will go up. That's what detraining does. And the thing that you would probably be most interested in is how much and how quickly. That's not an easy answer because the size and the speed of these reversals is very dependent on many factors. For instance, your current level of fitness, your training history, genetic factors, age, the specificity of previous training. For instance, it's been shown and is widely thought to be the case that people who have been training for a very long period are more resistant to the losses than people who've only been training for a short time. So if you have earned your fitness and your physiology over 6 years, you will lose less of it than you would had you earned it over 6 months. Similarly, training age, how many years you've been training, your current fitness levels, your biological age, all affect it. What is more interesting, I think, to you, because of course none of these things can be changed. You can't now go back 6 months or 6 years and work on gaining that fitness and physiology. So what's more interesting to you is, can I mitigate or reduce the effect of detraining? Here in South Africa, we're now in our 3rd week. We have another 3 to go. I know that the same is true in Ireland, where they've extended it into the 1st week of May. And realistically, no one really knows where lockdown ends. And so this is the question that might be causing your clients and potentially you a little bit of anxiety, is how do I not lose everything that I've worked for up to this point? Now, I'm going to try and show you this in an evidence-based way, working backwards. So I'm going to start with the principles and then offer you evidence that supports them. And the number one principle is use it or lose it. We get fit through training. We adapt to stress, we gain fitness. When the training's removed, we lose that fitness. So it's a use it or lose it concept. The good news is we don't lose as much as we had. I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. But that's fundamental to what you're trying to prevent over the next 3-6 weeks, who knows. The key point here is that small, smart investments go a long way to helping you keep your gains and your rewards from previous training. Now, if you're curious, you're wondering what that means. And it means a couple of things. Number one is the content. What do you do? And number two is the volume. How much? So what do I mean when I talk about small, smart investments? In terms of what to do, we know from studies, and I'm going to show you this, so don't take my word for it, that you can keep what you earned with smart adjustments to your training. And that means understanding two concepts, specificity and volume. On the other side, here on the right, how much do you need to do? I'm going to show you some studies that show that if you just do 20% of what you're used to, you can cut your losses in half. And even once a week will prevent and reduce that loss. So a little bit goes a long way. And you can take that, as I've said before, to the bank. And if you take nothing else from this presentation, just understand that every little bit that you do now counts. And it's a question of how you put those little bits together that makes them count more. So let's look into that. When I show you these studies, and I am going to bombard you, and I'm not apologizing for it with data, because I think it's important that you understand where knowledge comes from and how we know what we do, or think we know anyway. The studies are all designed in a similar way. They have a training block over which people acquire fitness and physiology. Then they do a test, which I'm going to highlight in light blue, and I'm going to call it pre. Then there's a period of detraining, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 30 weeks. I'm going to show you all these examples. Then we do a post test to determine how much has been lost as a result of detraining. And then sometimes there's a retraining period, which I'm also going to talk to you about. So effectively, what we have is fitness before, detraining, fitness after. And I'm going to hit you now with a whole bunch of studies to illustrate the concepts, the principles that matter. First of all, an amazing study that was done in Germany in 2017, in which they took a group of healthy men and they forced them into bed rest for 60 days. And by bed rest, I mean strict bed rest. They weren't allowed out. Unbelievable. If you think lockdown is bad, imagine being this participant. So no physical activity at all. What did they find? Nothing good. Bone mineral density, down. Lean mass of the leg, down. Knee extension strength, down a lot. Knee flexion strength, down. VO2 max, which is cardiovascular capacity, down. Peak power output, down. So pretty much everything you can think of declines as a consequence of bed rest. Now that's extreme. None of you, I hope, are in bed for the entire period of lockdown. But the point is, the total inactivity causes a large negative reversal. You lose in pretty much every domain, from bone health to cardiovascular to neuromuscular and muscle. So that's to be avoided. What about a little bit of activity? This was a study of top-level cyclists in Spain, Spanish cycling team, who basically at the end of their competitive season began a 4-week no training period. So these are guys who are going from doing, on average, 20 hours a week to doing nothing. Huge drop in training. What happens? Obviously, they're not confined to bed. They're still walking and active in daily life, but no structured training. Mass goes up, not a huge amount, 2.3%. They're obviously disciplined guys. They don't completely lose themselves when they stop training. Skin folds go up, statistically not significantly, but that's a 15% increase, which is, I guess, relatively large, although in absolute terms quite small. That shouldn't surprise you, though. If you take a guy who's done 20 hours a week and then all of a sudden they do nothing, they're going to gain a little bit of weight and they're going to gain a little bit of body fat because the stimulus to keep those things down is now gone. What's more important, I suppose, for those of you involved in training domains, is what happens to the VO2 max and the workload during a test. And you can see that VO2 max drops by just under 11%. So it's about 2.5–3% a week. And work peak, which is a peak power output test that they did, is down by about 8.5. So that's about 2 to 3% as well per week. So what does this tell you? This tells you the use it or lose it idea. So in top-level cyclists, body composition will change a little bit, and performance will change by actually quite a lot. And so when we completely inactivate and stop training, this is what happens. However, and here's where the good news starts to come in, is that doing even a small amount of training can massively slow down that loss of physiology and fitness. So again, we're talking elite athletes. This time it's kayakers. And what happens here is that they have these elite kayakers who at the end of the season either have no training for 5 weeks, as in zero, or they do reduced training for 5 weeks. In the entire group before the detraining period, their normal routine involved 2.5 to 3 hours of strength per week and 7 or 8 hours of kayaking per week. So we're talking around 10 hours a week of training, consisting of a mix of strength and kayaking or cardio work. And they're obviously taking that and going either to zero or to a reduced program, which consists of 1 strength session and 2 endurance sessions per week. So we're going from 10 to 0 or 10 to about 2 hours a week. So that's the That's a drop from 10 to 0 or 10 to 2 hours a week. So either way, it's a really small amount. It's next to nothing for these guys. This is what happens. VO2 max in the group that does nothing for 5 weeks drops by 11.3%. Remember our cyclists, 10.8. So it's about the same. You lose 2 to 3% per week in terms of VO2 max. However, have a look at this. The group of kayakers who did 3 sessions a week, which is 2 hours compared to their normal 10, only drops by 5.6. So what we're saying here is that tiny bit, that 20% of normal, cuts the losses from 11 down to just over 5, half the loss. Similar thing happens for power output. That's no training, down 8%, 3 sessions a week, down 4%. So what we're saying here is that even doing 20% of your normal volumes is enough that loss, which normally would have gone here, now goes to half of what it would have been otherwise. That's why I said earlier, a little bit goes a long way. Do what you can because none of it is wasted. So what we've got is in elite athletes, when we completely remove the stimulus, we cause changes in the range of 2 to 4% per week. Cyclists, kayakers, I've shown you that. The same is true in runners. I'm not going to kill you with studies here. Performance declines as a result, but even small amounts in the range of 10 to 20% of normal is enough to cut those losses in half. Your question might be, well, it's all good and well talking to me about elite athletes who have a solid training base, who have a long training history, who have entrenched adaptations and perhaps some genetic advantages. I want to know about non-elite athletes. And so let's have a look at some of the studies on non-elites. Here's a study that was done in 1990, so it's a little old, but nevertheless a goodie, in which they took a group of well-trained runners and they reduced their training for 3 weeks. They went from running 80 kilometers, that's 50 miles, give or take, on 6 days a week, down to running for 5 days a week, total of 25 Ks. So that again is a 75 to 80% reduction. These guys in reduced training are doing 20% of what they normally, well, it's actually a little bit more. It's about 30% of what they normally would be doing. But the key point here is that they kept the balance of intensity the same. So the percentage of their training time at high intensity and low intensity was kept similar between the normal and the reduced training periods. Let's have a look at what they find. Plasma volume drops. I've told you that because the endurance stimulus has gone away. In other words, they're not doing the 80 Ks a week. So the plasma volume, which relied on that stress to be increased, now falls. As a consequence of that, maximum heart rate is up by 2.3%. But here's the really interesting thing in the take-home message from the study. VO2 max did not change, and neither did their 5-kilometer time trial time. So what we're seeing here is some physiological detraining, but the performance is kept relatively similar. And one of the things driving that is the smart adaptation to training, where they kept the intensity of the training program the same. So yes, they took the endurance stimulus away, but they keep the intensity. And that's why you see the 5K time and the VO2 max, which is by definition a high intensity bout. Those things stay quite similar. So lesson here is be smart even when your time is limited. Here's a study which shows the same concept but from the other direction. Madsen in 1993, trained runners were made to do 5 weeks of reduced training where they took them from doing between 6 and 10 hours a week. So that would be more than 80 Ks like in the previous study. And they cut them down to 1 session a week of 35 minutes of high intensity training. So they go from 10 hours to half an hour. Huge, huge drop in training volumes. What do they find? VO2 max, no change. Again, this is a high intensity exercise bout, and because they kept the high intensity stimulus, they defended that loss. So it's the specificity drives what you do or do not lose. Heart rate during a submax run goes up. That should not surprise you. The endurance stimulus has been taken away almost completely. We're going from 8 hours to 30 minutes a week. So in the absence of that endurance stress, plasma volume, heart rate goes, plasma volume drops, heart rate goes up. Endurance capacity, huge drop, 21% loss. in their time to exhaustion at an intensity of 75% of VO2 max. This should not surprise you, again, because this is asking them to run for over an hour. Nothing in their training has prepared them for this particular stress. So this is about specificity. I hope you follow this. If we take away endurance, we lose endurance. If we keep intensity, we lose endurance, but we defend the intensity component of our performance spectrum. Does that make sense? So what you're looking at here is that because there was no endurance-specific work in that 5-week period, their endurance performance is compromised most. Similarly, we see when they worked out fuel use, and this is the percentage of energy from fat, it goes from 37% before to 30% after. So fat oxidation is down. That again is a symptom of not doing endurance training, because that's normally what keeps fat oxidation up. So here, what we're looking at is a study that confirms that the specificity matters, and you will defend in the domains that you train. In this study, they did not train endurance, therefore they lost endurance. They kept a intensity stimulus, and so they were better able to defend on the intensity side of it. So hopefully that concept makes sense. And then finally, before I start getting onto strength work, this is all cardio focused for now. Here's a study which I've shown you earlier. It's that study from Kramer et al., where they put people in bed for 60 days. But what I didn't tell you is that some of the people in that study didn't just lie in bed for 60 days. They were actually allowed to do 3 minutes of hopping exercises 6 days a week. Now, they basically built this contraption that allowed them to do this hopping stuff while they were in bed, which is bizarre, but there you go. And what it involved is that they would do counter movement jumps and hops for 3 minutes a day, 3 minutes over 24 hours. And this is what effect it had. So here you're looking at bone density in the tibia. The blue lines show you the people who did the hopping. The orange lines are the people who just stayed in bed. And what you will see is that 3 minutes of hopping prevents bone mineral density loss or bone mineral content loss that occurs without it. So just 3 minutes a day is enough to defend the health of the bones. Similarly, lean mass in the leg. Remember I told you earlier that lean mass drops in the people who just stayed in bed? Look at what happens when you do 3 minutes of hopping. You actually protect against that loss. Leg strength, the group who did nothing lose 41% of their knee extension leg strength. The group who hops, 3%. VO2 max, the group who does nothing, 29% lower. The group who hops 3 minutes a day, 5%. And lastly, peak power output dropped by 29% in our control group who did nothing, but only 12% in the jumping group. This is remarkable because what it shows you is that when you take the stress away completely, you get all those negative changes. But just 3 minutes of hopping and counter movement jumps per day or 6 times a week is enough to massively reduce those losses. So again, every little bit that you can do counts. So what have we got? In non-elite trained athletes, we see the similar effects to the elite athletes. Plasma volume goes down, cardiac function is affected, the engine decreases in size, but we can hang on to those gains. They don't completely disappear. We've seen that metabolically our fuel use shifts because basically what's happening is that there's no demand. And so the supply doesn't need to meet this high demand. And as a consequence, we shut down our factories. Our mitochondrial mass drops, our enzyme content goes down. And as a result, we burn less fat and have a lower energy producing capacity after detraining. But same thing as with elite athletes, small training volumes go a long way to minimizing and sometimes preventing these losses entirely. The key is the specificity and volume of training still matter. And so you cannot expect to retain your endurance gains and advantages if you don't do a component of endurance training. But if you keep the intensity of training high and relatively similar to what you are accustomed to, then you will massively improve on those high intensity type tasks after detraining. Next question, what happens for strength variables? Here's a study I showed you, kayakers. Now I realize these are not strength trained athletes, but they do a significant portion of their training as strength work. It's 3 hours a week of strength sessions. what happens to them as a consequence of either not training at all or massively reducing the training. This is bench press 1RM when you do nothing for 5 weeks, drops by 9%. Remember, there's a group that does 3 sessions a week, one of which is a strength session. So we're going from 3 strength sessions to 1 strength session a week, half the loss. So in other words, 1 session a week is enough to cut the losses in half. And similarly, bench pull is down by just under 8% with no training and just over 3% with 1 strength session out of 3 sessions per week. So here again, we see 20% of the training, and in this instance, 1 strength session a week compared to 3 strength sessions normally is enough to cut your losses in half. Here are 2 studies in older men, which looked at a similar concept. Here's Henwood in 2008. They had a 6-month training block, followed by 6 months of detraining. So that's big. I mean, please let this lockdown not last for 6 months, but this is to illustrate a point. And then they retrained them for 3 months, 12 weeks. What they found is, again, light blue for detraining, dark blue for retraining, is that the 24 weeks of detraining caused them to lose about 16 to 17% of their strength. That was assessed as bench press, upright rows, biceps curls, leg press, leg curls, and leg extensions. So they lose strength as a consequence of detraining. When they then retrain for 12 weeks, they gain back all the strength that they lost. So in other words, you can lose over 24 weeks and then gain it back in half that time. So that's really important to understand, is that you will get back what you've lost quicker than you lost it if you come in from a reasonable base of training. Similar finding in a study by a French author whose name I'm afraid I'm going to butcher if I try and pronounce it. And this one was actually just published. I'm going to show you one finding. This was a study in which they had 12 weeks of training, 12 weeks of detraining, and then a retraining period over 12 weeks. What you're looking at here is the 1 rep maximum on a leg press. Here's the 12 weeks of training that you can see. You can see that they improve massively over those 12 weeks by 36%. It's a great gain in older men, encouraging for those of you who work with older clients. Then over 12 weeks of detraining, not surprisingly, you've seen this already, they lose strength. In this instance, 14% of that initial strength is lost. Then over 12 weeks of retraining, what you will see is that they gain it back and then some. So the gain back is 24%. The end result is that after the 12 weeks of retraining, they're actually stronger than they were after the 12 weeks of training. So this is an encouraging message. So in summary, detraining over 12 weeks causes only partial loss of strength. And they found this for 1RM, which I'm showing you, but also for isometric and isokinetic strength and peak power. So it happens across the board. And then what happens over retraining period is that within the first 4 weeks of retraining, they have regained 75% of those losses. Look how quickly it goes back up. And then it gets back to its pre-training values within about 6 weeks. So again, what you lose in 12 weeks can be regained in 6 weeks. Same thing that I showed you here. What you lose in 24 can be regained in 12. So that's a promising message. So let's summarize what we know about strength training. I'm not going to show you all the studies. You'll be glad to know. The early losses in strength with detraining are neurological. The good news is that they're also the first to come back. So when we take away the strength training stimulus, because we can no longer get into the gym and lift heavy weights, we lose relatively quickly what we can regain relatively quickly. So that's promising, good news. Studies have found that there are minimal differences in lean mass, muscle synthesis, muscle fiber area, or strength, as long as you lift to fatigue, irrespective of heavy or light. Now, this is somewhat contentious, but what we're saying here, and this is a quote from a Morton study in 2016, is that load, in other words, how much weight you lift, when exercises are performed to failure, does not dictate hypertrophy or, for the most part, strength gains. And have a look at that Morton study if you want to see more on that. Here's another example. This is from a group of studies in Stuart Phillips's lab in Canada, in which they're basically saying that the key to gaining gaining strength, hypertrophy, size, and so on, is training to fatigue or failure. And so this is an example. I know it's small, but it's from a Mitchell study. It's part of that Phillips group of studies, where they found that the volume change in the quadriceps was similar whether you lifted 30% or 80% of your 1 rep max, as long as you train to fatigue. If you don't train to fatigue and you do low volume, then you don't get that increase. So as long as you are lifting to failure, you can get the strength and the volume changes. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because one of the big things that lockdown is going to affect for those of you who are strength training habitually is that you no longer have access to the machines and the dumbbells and the barbells, unless you've got your own fancy home gym, of course. And so you might be concerned about, how do I keep my gains? The answer is that you make sure that you train to fatigue or to failure, because that seems to be one of the key predictors of hypertrophy and strength, not necessarily load. That doesn't negate the specificity issue and the load issue. And so this is a study that was published again in 2020, in which they compared 20% of 1RM to failure to 40%, 60%, and 80%. And again, what you'll see here is that when you train with heavier weights, your cross-sectional area does go up. But look at the 20%. You can still cause an increase in muscle size and strength by lifting light weights, as long as you lift to fatigue. So that is really important, but it doesn't negate specificity. So if you are someone who is looking to train for strength and maximum strength, 1RM, power, and that, specific specialized areas of strength and velocity of lifting, think creatively about how to get your intensity up. So for instance, you might try single leg variations instead of 2. You might look at isometric exercises. You might train with a partner and see if they can increase the load, because it is difficult. If you're accustomed to, shoulder pressing or bench pressing in the 100 kilogram range, and you no longer have access to that, then you've got to think a little bit creatively in order to defend that. But don't lose heart, because the point I'm trying to make with these graphs and these Phillips studies is that the stimulus is still large as long as you train to fatigue, that you won't lose everything you've gained. And then just also remember, for those of you who mix your training up, that there is a concept of interference, where if you increase endurance training, it does compromise strength and hypertrophy. Now, I know that in lockdown, doing endurance work might be more difficult than strength work. So it's the reverse situation that's going to be more common. And that doesn't really seem to affect, strength training doesn't affect endurance as much as endurance affects strength. So, but just bear in mind that if you change the balance of your training, there may be some interference effects over the lockdown period. To conclude, and I want to start working towards some practical conclusions, and I've taken enough of your time. How do we get back to the peak? So we're going to eventually, at some point, lockdown will be over and you'll be back into training, and you want to know, how do I get back there when the gyms are open again? The time that it takes to retrain, which is to return to fitness, to regain the performance and the physiology that you had before, depends on many factors. It's kind of like, remember earlier I told you that detraining depends on age and genetics and training history and fitness. So does the rebound, in effect. But the length and degree of detraining are crucial. So if detraining is shorter, you'll have a faster return. That, unfortunately, is not entirely up to you. It's up to governments who are going to decide when the fitness centers and the gyms reopen. But the key thing that you can control, and this is true for your clients, is that any training equals faster return. So as long as you keep going, and I've shown you kayak studies, running studies, weightlifting studies, where even doing small amounts massively reduces the amount that you would lose, so that you don't go from here to here, you go from here to there. So do what you can. For both cardiovascular and strength training, it appears that the improvement on retraining is faster than the loss on detraining. So here's a study from 1991, shows a similar thing to what I've already shown you. What they did here is they trained them for 20 weeks, and you can see how much stronger they got. Then they detrained them for 30 weeks. So that's 7.5, 8 months of detraining. Huge, huge detraining period. And then they retrained them over 6 weeks. And that's what happens. So The training caused a 140% increase in strength. This is of leg press. The detraining over 30 weeks caused a 30% decrease. So see, key point, you don't lose so much that you go back to where you began. So keep the faith. Even if you don't do anything, you're still not going to go back to where you started from. But what I really want to emphasize is that when we then start training again, within 6 weeks, we can see a 35% increase in leg press strength again, to the point that we almost get back to where we came from within 6 weeks after a 30-week detraining. Same thing for squats. In fact, even more pronounced. We get stronger, we get weaker, and then we get stronger really, really quickly. So look at these people. Their squat after 6 weeks is higher than it was before 30 weeks of detraining. The point is it comes back quickly. But what you do now during this lockdown will go a long way to determining what your prognosis is in June, July onwards. So do what you can. Let's wrap up. Practical applications. Use it or lose it is the key that drives all these things. There's a cost-benefit decision that you have to make regarding your exercise goals and those of your clients. I know many of you work with clients who are obsessed and concerned with weight and body fat. Managing their expectations is really important. And you have to understand that it's not in their best interest to have them run for an hour and a half a day around their house. That's probably not wise. And so your job, your number one function is to manage expectations and understand that cost-benefit relationship. This is a stressful time for people. Don't pile even more stress and anxiety on in the form of exercise, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, let's go back one slide. The key message from many of these studies is that if you're going to maintain something, make it intensity. If you can defend the intensity of training, you can greatly slow down those losses. Whereas a reduction in volume can be withstood within reason. I've shown you studies where if you cut the volume too much, you lose the endurance adaptations that volume normally triggers. So just bear that in mind, but focus on intensity. When you do that, be very careful about unusual loading types, patterns, and speed. If your client or you are a long distance runner or you cycle, and you all of a sudden start to do plyometric exercises and strength work in your back garden because it's all you can do, those loadings are unusual. You're going to cause local muscle fatigue, which could predispose you to injury. And so just be mindful of managing training just like you normally would, and don't overdo the new stuff. Related to that, when you start doing high intensity work like plyometrics and fast eccentric training, I told you about that hopping study and the massive benefit that it produced for those people. Just be careful. Those things load you at 6 or more times body weight. If you're not accustomed to it, it's an injury risk. So be sensible here. And be very mindful of training monotony. Your value as a personal trainer is that you can come with a bit of creativity. So don't just do the same thing over and over and over, even if it's working, because monotonous training leads to injuries and burnout and boredom. And then conservatively, when it comes time to retrain again, I would assume a one-to-one retraining plan when you can resume. So in other words, if your client has missed 5 weeks of normal training, conservatively plan for 5 weeks of retraining. And then after 1 week, you'll be able to make a call on whether you can accelerate that or not. Because I've shown you some data that retraining tends to happen in half the time that detraining did. So if you lost it over 6 weeks, you could probably get it back in 3. But if you want to be conservative, go one-to-one until you see better, and then you can accelerate it. And that's where your skill as a systematic thinker comes in. So you've got to be guided by regular monitoring and feedback. You should be monitoring all the time. How's my client? What have they lost? What have they retained? What can I do once we start retraining? Holistic understanding. I said to you earlier, I'm not encouraging you to do nothing over the course of lockdown, but sometimes exercise is the straw that breaks the camel's back. So don't force it on your clients or yourself. Just accept, be kind to yourself, and give yourself an opportunity to deal with these stressful, anxious times. If it means no exercise or less exercise, it's fine. And then third is appropriate goals. I think that's really important. We don't know when lockdown ends. but you can manage your clients' expectations and manage your own expectations around what you're going to achieve in this lockdown period. And then my very last point before I conclude is about mindset. I understand how frustrating this time is. Those of you who are personal trainers, your ability to earn income has been taken away from you. I get it. It's frustrating. For your clients who've worked and lost, let's say, 5 or 6 kilograms since the beginning of the year, to now go into this phase where they can't keep doing what worked must be extremely frustrating. I get that. But if you can change your mindset around this and recognize that this is an opportunity, it's an opportunity for you to give to your clients things that they need to do, but that they may not always have liked to do. For instance, core stability work. How many runners and cyclists neglect that? Yet you know that if you can get that into their training program, they'll be stronger and less likely to be injured. Here's your chance. Similarly, strength work, upper body, lower body, stability work on the ankles, proprioception. These are the kinds of training sessions you can do, you need to do, and now you have to do, as opposed to the stuff that your clients like to do. So use this as an opportunity. Be positive, be optimistic, and turn the challenge into an opportunity. That's my mandate and challenge to all of you. That's about it. I'd like to say thanks. You can find me on Twitter, Science of Sport. And I've also just recently set up a Patreon account, which is This Science of Sport. And so you can follow me there. If you feel like pledging and donating to the work, feel free. But just really, guys, stay healthy, stay positive, stay sane, keep training, and see you on the flip side of lockdown. Ciao.